Today on Living History, we're speaking with Jaime FlorCruz.
It was very exciting because that was the day when I got into Peking University, 1977, the year after Mao died. So one of the first things that Deng Xiaoping did was to restore the so-called Gaokao, which is the National College Entrance Exam. Something like 5 million Chinese youth took that exam. And so I felt fortunate that I was entering Beida, the Peking University, at that time.
Today on Living History, we're speaking with Jaime FlorCruz, who arrived in China in 1971. At that time, he was a student leader in the Philippines, and together with other Philippine youth leaders, he was invited to take a look at Mao's new China for 3 weeks. But while he was in China, the Marcos government back in the Philippines declared a state of emergency and made it impossible for him to return. This dramatic development changed his life. He joined the famous Peking University class of 1977, where he studied at the same time as Li Keqiang and Bo Xilai. He later worked as a journalist for Time magazine and for CNN, and today he is the ambassador of the Philippines in China. He's also the author of a fascinating book about his extraordinary life called The Class of 77, How My Classmates Changed China. We're very glad to speak with him today. Jaime FlorCruz, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
You know, when I opened your book, I came to it with certain expectations because so few people had come to China in those early days. And so I thought you would be similar to Edgar Snow, to Joan Hinton. But the truth is, you were completely different. Your situation was much more nuanced. So what was your impression, your idea of China before you came here? And then what did you see when you actually landed?
I knew very little of China when I first came to China in 1971. I've read some books of Edgar Snow, read Star Over China. I read dribs and drabs of magazine stories, newspaper stories about this Red China, as China was known at that time. But China to me was this mysterious place that we all wished to visit and see for ourselves. But it was so isolated diplomatically, logistically, that it never hit me, it never dawned on me that I would have a chance to see China with my own eyes, and I did.
That's actually really interesting. Why did the Chinese government, I suppose, seek you guys out as student leaders?
Well, China at that time was diplomatically isolated. They had very few diplomatic relations with other countries. So they had very few visitors, only invited visitors, very few tourists would come here. But at that time, I believe, August 1971, China was already plotting its way to opening its door. Remember, in July 1971, Henry Kissinger, as the envoy of President Richard Nixon, secretly visited China. He was visiting Pakistan, pretended to get sick, disappeared, and then took a special plane into Beijing and laid the groundwork for President Nixon's visit the next year, February 1972. So that was July. And we were invited August 21. Why us? I think it's because we were all kind of leftists. We were, why we were leftists? We were against the Vietnam War. We were for land reform in the Philippines. We were against corruption and nepotism. And for that, we were branded as leftists. So in that sense, I think from the perspective of the Chinese, we were sympathetic, or at least we were interested in what was going on in China. And again, it was their way of opening China's door ajar in preparation for the formal or the kind of grand opening of China when President Nixon visited in February 1972.
You had written that you had imagined China from the Philippines as a socialist utopia, where everything was fair and everybody was cared for. What was it like when you actually landed in Shanghai or in China? How did you arrive, actually?
Actually, well, first, it was technically illegal for Filipinos to travel into China or other communist-controlled countries at that time. In fact, my passport was stamped with a note, not valid for travel to countries, the former Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Korea, and China. So technically, we were not supposed to be visiting China at that time, but it didn't stop us from proceeding with our visit. So we flew from the Philippines to Hong Kong on August 20. In Hong Kong, we met up with the staff of the China Travel Service, and the person gave us our tickets into China, and also that one piece of Chinese visa. It was a piece of paper that was clipped or stapled onto our passport. And so the next day, August 21, we took a train from Hong Kong into Shenzhen, that sleepy village town at that time. We had lunch in Shenzhen, and then we took another train from Shenzhen to Guangzhou, the capital of Guangdong. We had a very quick bus tour of the city, and then went to the airport and took a propeller-driven Ilyushin plane from Guangzhou to Beijing. It took about 6 hours at that time. So we arrived in Beijing, August 21, at night. And we were, of course, welcomed by a group of officers from the China Friendship Association, which was our official host. They were the ones who sent the invitation to us. And they were the ones who welcomed us at the airport, along with, I think, 5 or 6 representatives of the Red Guards. So that's how we first arrived. Now, my first impression, of course, was because it was in the evening, riding the bus from the airport into Beijing. It was kind of dark, but my impression was of this long row of willow trees that lined the 2-lane road from the airport to the city. We stayed at the Peking Hotel, and that's how we started our first day in China.
You had planned to stay for 3 weeks. Were you allowed to speak with Chinese people in those days? Was it difficult? And what would they ask you?
So, of course, none of us spoke Mandarin at that time, so we all had to converse with our hosts and the Chinese through our interpreters. We did have a sit-down dialogue with a bunch of Red Guards, youth leaders, because we were supposed to be the Philippine Youth Delegation. And China was still in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And the Red Guards were still there, although they have been, I think, they have mellowed. But we had an exchange of views about what it's like to be young people in our country and in their country, what the Red Guards were doing. Many of them had been sent to the countryside. And that was part of, the kind of toning down the radical movement of the Red Guards. I remember arriving and meeting them, and I thought my hair was longer than the bobbed hair of the Chinese Red Guards at that time. They were all wearing white shirts and very short hair. And they were all very passionate about what they believed in, determined to serve the country, to go to the most difficult parts of China and help build China. So that was the closest we could have conversations on a formal level. Of course, during the trip, we were able to visit the Peking University, and we had some time talking with the professor, including the Vice Chancellor Zhou Peiyuan, who was a very famous physicist. We had talks with the students on campus at that time. We played basketball with the varsity team. So we would have such conversations, but all in a kind of a chaperoned way. We were always with chaperones, including visits to the department store or the foreign languages bookstore at that time, the children's, what do you call that, Ertong, the children's home at that time, where the children trained in piano and ping pong and all that. So we had a range of visits in our first few days in Beijing. They also took us to a hospital where we watched an operation using acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. And then very soon, I think the fourth day, they took us to Yan'an, which was a revolutionary base that the Chinese communist leaders used in fighting the Japanese at that time. So we managed to see the caves where Chairman Mao and the other communist leaders and army leaders lived. And that's the time when we were told that something happened in the Philippines that may affect our plans to whether we could return home. It was actually our Chinese hosts who broke the news to us, but they said they had no details, and eventually they helped fly from Hong Kong to Beijing some of the old newspapers so that we were able to see the reporting of what was going on at home, and that allowed us to make decisions on whether to go home or not.
How did you feel the first days when it became clear to you you would have to stay?
It was very shocking in the beginning, and then it was very difficult because the idea of staying indefinitely started to loom, that we couldn't go home as planned on time. So kind of loneliness and homesickness had started to dawn, but we were still hoping that things could still change back home, but it didn't. A year later, martial rule was imposed, and then another year later, my passport expired.
You just mentioned loneliness, and that really struck me in your book, because you were a 20-something-year-old boy, and you wrote, as foreigners, we were not allowed to socialize. How does a 20-something-year-old deal with such loneliness in a new country?
It was very difficult. It was, I think, aside from any physical pain, it was the pain of being lonely and being homesick that was hard to bear. A 20-year-old born and bred in the Philippines, where we enjoyed freedom to speak, but also freedom to do what young people did. And then missing out on what the family was doing, missing friends, that was very difficult because it's like being plunked in a place where the culture was very different, especially at that time. And China was still in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, and there were many taboos, ideologically, politically driven taboos, that made it at least very different, if not alien, for somebody like me who grew up in the Philippines at a tender age.
And then you went to a farm.
Yeah.
You got your Chinese name, and you started learning Chinese.
Yes. I started learning Chinese from Ming Jang, who at that time was sent to be our interpreter while we were settling in a state farm in Hunan province. And that idea came because when we realized it was going to be a longer stay instead of the 3 weeks as planned, we started to think, what will we do? What can we do while waiting to go home? And so we asked our host, can we enroll in a language school so that we could at least learn some Mandarin, survival Chinese? But our host said, no, the schools, the colleges have just started to reopen after the Cultural Revolution, and they were not enrolling foreigners. So that was out of the question. But we insisted we want to learn more about China. And that's why we came here. We want to find out what's going on. And so they said, in that case, why don't you do what our young Chinese do, which is to go down the countryside for some re-education, meaning you learn the reality from the working people, from the farmers. So we thought, wow, okay, that sounds like a romantic idea, right? It's like perhaps going to a kibbutz in Israel or the hippies in the U.S. And so we said, yes, why don't we do that? And then we said, where are we going? And then they said, we'll arrange so you go to a state farm in Hunan province, Chairman Mao's hometown or birthplace. So we took out a map of China, and then we looked at Hunan, which was south of Beijing, and we thought, oh, that'll be good. It probably has a better weather, warmer weather than Beijing. We were wrong, because the week we got to Hunan in December 1971, it was snowing, almost knee-deep, thick. I mean, we were excited because it's the first time we saw snow ever, but it was a signal that life was going to change, because life on the farm was Spartan. Very basic essentials were available, but there was no heating inside and outside. It was not as cold as Beijing, but it still was cold and humid. And so we had to get used to having layers of clothing, cotton padded pants and cotton padded jackets and hats while working in the fields. So it was very difficult. Life was Spartan, but physical work was difficult. I grew up in a middle-class family in the Philippines. My parents were both working, so we were well off. We had 2 house helpers. I didn't even have to wash dishes. But so it took a while to get used to the physical rigors of farming. But I think most difficult was the emotional, mental kind of pressure and the sense of loneliness and homesickness and monotony of life. There was nothing else to do after work except maybe play basketball or badminton. But winter set in, you can't really play often. We had a small black and white TV in the whole village. But soon after we got there, the fuse burned and it was never repaired. So radio sometimes was the only kind of source of information, if not entertainment. And entertainment too was very boring because much of what's available were official propaganda. There were only 8 model revolutionary operas and ballets that were allowed on stage. And then on the radio, there were songs that were all steeped in politics and ideology. So that was very bad, and that was very hard for us. And for a 21-year-old, that was even more more of really a torture of sorts.
What was it like for people like Ming Jang? I believe he had never been abroad. All he had was a book.
Well, at that time, yes, he had never been abroad, but he was already in the foreign ministry. And I believe he went back to his original job as a staff of the foreign ministry. He had this asset of knowing English. And so he was very good at what he did. And he had this flair of singing Peking opera. He taught me an aria or two of Peking opera. He regaled me with a lot of his stories about what's going on in China, about the prime minister at that time, Zhou Enlai. He was a big admirer of Zhou Enlai. And yeah, in a way, he also shared some of his family's information. We exchanged ideas and experiences that way. So he was kind of a blessing for me in terms of putting a face on China at that time, but also in getting me started in Mandarin. He was a very good teacher, a tough teacher, like a schoolmaster, but he got me started in learning Mandarin, and you know, I really owed him a lot. And in a way, his time with us probably benefited him, because he rose up in the foreign ministry hierarchy, and he retired as China's ambassador to European Union in London. Or no, he was a senior officer in the Chinese embassy in London, and then retired as the EU ambassador, China's ambassador to EU.
Did you later still have contact? Did you guys reminisce?
We had infrequent contacts or exchanges by phone, and he's now he's not in good health lately, so I haven't seen him again since I came back.
Yeah. When did it change? When were you allowed to socialize, to fraternize, to have a girlfriend?
Very late. It was China at that time had this unwritten taboo about fraternizing, foreigners fraternizing with Chinese, and the other way around. So a liaison with Chinese was very dangerous at that time. There were times when you are staying in a guest house, in a hostel, and you see this rosy-cheeked waitresses, and you can only kind of chat and look at them. So it was very frustrating for a 20-ish guy like me. So it really took me until around the time 1974, when I was already studying at the Beijing Languages Institute, when I met a Chinese girl outside the classroom, and we kind of flirted a little bit, which I wrote in the book. So it was kind of a gamble, for a foreigner to fraternize with a Chinese girl, and the other way around too. It was very difficult. In fact, among Chinese, not just between foreigners and Chinese, at that time in the 70s, girl-boy relationship among Chinese was very stilted and controlled. I remember my Chinese friends were telling me high school girls and boys, when after school, they would walk back home, the boys on one side of the street and the girls on the other side of the street. They were not supposed to kind of mingle freely as normally one would. So that was the time. The 70s was still a very puritanical, not just culturally but ideologically puritanical, very strict rules, and there were a lot of taboos, no-nos that you had to abide by. Otherwise, you get into trouble.
Yeah, Malia Tai Tai and Jubao were things.
That's right. Yes, there was always a Malia Tai Tai in the neighborhood, and you get reported if they sense something was wrong or abnormal by their standards. So you have to be really careful, and some people get into trouble because of that. They are branded as liumang, hooligans, simply for doing what is normal between a boy and a girl.
But then also you got to experience the dramatic changes in the years coming. I mean, the Malia Tai Tai went away, foreign experts came, ballroom dancing came.
Right.
And do you remember the first day you walked through West Gate at Beida?
Yes, October 1977. It was the fall, so the weather was perfect. Sky was blue, or the leaves were turning red and yellow. But it was very exciting because that was the day when I got into Peking University, 1977, the year after Mao died, the year when Deng Xiaoping came back to power, and the year when Deng started to push his blueprint for an open and reforming China. So that was an exciting time. Deng wanted to push his vision, but then he quickly realized that he didn't have the battalion of intellectuals and professionals that he would need to push his vision. So one of the first things that Deng Xiaoping did was to restore the so-called Gaokao, which is the national college entrance exam. For 9 years under Mao, they got rid of that. They stopped that. Instead of having this national entrance exam, they started to enroll students from the ranks of the workers, peasants, and farmers, and soldiers. And instead of testing their academic abilities, they were tested and accepted based on their ideological level and political reliability. So they were called the Gongnongbing Xueyuan, the worker, peasant, soldier students. By 1977, they stopped enrolling the students that way and instead restored the Gaokao. So late that year, they started to give exams, national exams. Something like 5 million Chinese youth took that exam. That included the high school graduates of that year, plus the many other youth who graduated earlier, and 5 million of them took that exam, coveting something like 250,000 slots in colleges and universities, plus 400,000 positions for technical and vocational schools. So you can imagine the competition at that time, 5 million trying to get into less than 1 million slots. And schools like Peking University got the best of the best brains that passed the exam. And so I felt fortunate that I was entering Beida, the Peking University, at that time when you are studying with a group of young but passionate youth who had spent some time, many of them had spent some time in the countryside or in the factories. And so they knew what life was like. They knew what went wrong when they were growing up, especially during the Cultural Revolution. And so a lot of the discussions in the classroom and outside the classroom were not just about academic stuff, but about politics, about what does reform mean, what does opening up mean, what kind of challenges they would face if they opened up China's door. What do they need to do, and what role the students will play, after graduation. So it was a very exciting time. There was a lot of debates among us about what went wrong, but also where China should go, and about ideological and political issues that were current at that time.
At this point, we would like to take a moment to tell you about our project. The period between China's opening in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping and the 2010 Shanghai Expo deserves to be remembered. We want to collect the memories that Chinese, Americans, and other foreigners made together during these times. We hope you will subscribe to our channel to see many more interviews like this one in the coming weeks. If you too have a story that you think needs to be remembered, we would very much like to hear from you. And we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate in Shanghai for their generous support. Without their sponsorship, we would not have been able to start this channel.
Do any of the students you were studying with particularly stick out to you? Any memories?
Well, of course, the famous ones is the late former Prime Minister Li Keqiang. He was in the class of law students, the first law students who enrolled after the Cultural Revolution. That class produced a lot of good lawyers as well, some working in the Chinese government, others working for multinational companies in China and overseas. Then, of course, you have Bo Xilai, who was in my class, Chinese history class. He rose up from being a county leader to a mayor of Dalian, and then later as the party secretary of Chongqing. He's a very special person because he is a princeling, a son of a revolutionary veteran, very privileged family. But he was also he was very charismatic, and I would say he was also quite smart in class when we were together, but also when he was a bureaucrat, a technocrat, a political leader. He was very popular when he was in Dalian. I still hear people praising him for having done so much in the places where he worked. Even then, Bo was very active, charismatic. He loved to listen to classical music, and he loved ballroom dancing as well. So I thought he was a fairly regular guy for somebody who came from a privileged family. We also have a lot of other alumni who went to different paths. There's Wang Juntao, who was very young at that time, a wonderkind of physics major, but in the end he was a very passionate advocate of democracy and liberalism in China, and for that he paid a high price. He is a dissident in exile in the United States. So a lot of the brilliant minds took up different roles over the years in China and outside China. Many of them also have landed good jobs in the business world. The former head of the People's Bank of China, Li Keqiang, was from that class. Again, a very brilliant mind, went to study in the United States, got his PhD, was an associate professor until he was lured to come back to China and help the then Premier Zhou Rongji to revamp China's financial sector. And I think he retired as the People's Bank of China president on a high note.
You were no slouch either. You became a TV star early on.
Well, yes, I guess for lack of any other talents that they could find. As an amateur singer, I was roped into joining a band of amateur musicians because the national television station, CCTV, had been teaching English on TV, and with a huge following, many young Chinese learned English, basic English, watching TV, and so to spice up their program, they wanted to start a series of 10 programs teaching English songs every week, once a week. So they invited us to form that group, and we sang, and we taped our program singing old-fashioned English songs, which was also explained, with all the grammar and new words through the 30 minutes of singing this song. It's called English on Sunday. So it ran every Sunday. I got a lot of followers at that time. I remember checking in a hotel in Sichuan, and the person recognized me as somebody he watched on TV. A few years ago, I was in a plane going to Gansu from Beijing, and one guy recognized me. By then, he must have been 50 years old, and he remembered watching the show on TV. So something came out of it.
That was something I would have never expected when I picked up the book.
Yeah, sometimes if you go with the flow, it takes you to something interesting and different and rewarding.
Something else that I didn't expect was that you got to experience what it was like to travel to the West for many Chinese for the first time, because in 1983, you went to Hong Kong and you were overwhelmed by the choice of bread.
Yes, that was my first trip outside China after 12 years of exile in China. So when I first got my passport, I wanted to go home, but I couldn't go home yet. So my first trip outside China was to go to Hong Kong for a few days. And I remember landing in Hong Kong, and then I couldn't figure out many things. I felt like, I was like a Chinese farmer from Gansu who landed in a big city. I was always looking upwards, looking at the skyscrapers. I couldn't figure out how to use the revolving door in the hotels because my timing was off. Then I go out to have a quick meal, a quick lunch. I sit down. The waiter gives me a menu, and then there were a lot of choices, and then I had to choose what kind of bread for the sandwich, what kind of dressing for my salad, and I said that I'm too confused. In China, it was very simple. They give you a bowl of noodles and maybe a mantou, a steamed bun, and that's it. No questions asked. You don't have to make any choices. So that was quite an adjustment for me. Re-entering, it's like re-entering the Earth after a few days in space. And many things had changed by then, of course. Many songs were unfamiliar, many movies were new to me, and fashion was different. But most of all, the choices that were available at that time was quite shocking, coming out of socialist China at that time.
You know, your experience of coming to China in those early years, staying at the tail end of a cultural revolution, going to Beida, that's already the story of a lifetime. But you went on and started working in journalism in China at a time of dramatic changes. How did that happen?
It was also by chance. I went with the flow. I was in my senior year at Peking University, 1981. I had finished all the required courses, so I was focusing on writing my graduation thesis, and I decided to focus on the Yaorzhou Yundong, a youth movement, because it was close to my experience, but also because there were still many survivors of that youth movement Japanese war. So I was focused on putting that together. I had interviewed some of the participants of that youth movement who were still alive, retired but still alive. So it was more like writing a reportage rather than an academic thesis. But it was very interesting for me because it combined my love for journalism and for history. But meantime, one day I was having dinner in a friend's house, and she was by then working for the New York Times as her news assistant of Fox Butterfield, Jan Wong. And she mentioned over dinner that, I've been doing this for Fox, for the Fox Butterfield, cutting and pasting and filing news, and I get paid handsomely. She said, I remember you were a journalist, campus journalist in the Philippines. Aren't you interested? And I said, yeah, I am interested, but I'm not sure if it's the right thing to do. I'm not sure what my Chinese host would think, working for an American imperialist newspaper or magazine. So after that, I went back to my dormitory in Peking University, and then one of my mentors visited me, and I told him that I have this possibility of working part-time for this Newsweek magazine, because I had knocked around and Newsweek was interested to hire me for that. And I told him I have this possibility of, earning extra money part-time, but I said, I'm not sure if that's good. I'm not sure if that's right. And he said, how old are you, Jimmy? And I said, 26, 27. And how long have you lived in China? I said, 6 years. And he said, you're a mature man. You know what to do, what best to do. Then he left. And it's a typical Chinese answer. So I said, is that a yes or a no? And then I said, I think that's a yes. It's okay. So, but the only way to find out is to try. So the next week I reported for a researcher's position at the Newsweek Bureau. Melinda Liu, the bureau chief, gave me that job. And so I did that. I think I went once a week, and then it became twice a week, 2 afternoons a week. I would go to town to the office, and then I would start clipping and filing stories, and then filing them according to topics. I did that for several weeks until Melinda realized that actually I spoke Chinese and I had many friends outside. So she said, forget about, clipping and filing. Why don't you go out and talk to your friends? And so she would give me topics of what she was working on, and then I would do that, and then I'll go back and then type out a one-page memo or whatever I find out, and she would weave them into her stories, and that's how I started. Soon enough, she was assigning me to do other stories myself, and so I remember some stories I did then was about the street performers, doing. I remember watching street performers doing qigong, and people were giving a little money, and so I wrote a small piece for Newsweek. That was my first published story with my photograph and my byline. And then the big story was my coverage of the Gang of Four trial, the trial of Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four, who were tried publicly in January 1982, sentenced. And so Newsweek went big on that. And that's when the editors of Newsweek heard of this Filipino in Beijing who could write, and that's how my career started and blossomed. After that, I worked for Newsweek for a couple more months, and then I moved to Time Magazine a year later because Time was willing to hire me as a full-time correspondent. So I worked for Time for 16 years, the last 10 as Beijing bureau chief. And then later I moved to CNN for 14 years.
Were there stories that you're now remembering but you're especially proud of?
Well, of course, the coverage of the Gang of Four for Newsweek. For Time, I did many stories, but I think I'm most proud of a story I did on the migrant workers' exodus into the big cities. At that time, it was just beginning. I think we spoke of some 70 million farmers moving to non-farming jobs into the cities. But we thought that trend was very important because it meant it had an angle of economic, social, as well as personal stories, migrant, because farmers at that time were on the losing end in terms of economic benefits. Their farmers' produce were fixed price, so they labor for a year, they have the harvest for the year, but at the end of the year they had very little cash for all the work that they've done. And so many of them became redundant on their farms, so they started to look for jobs in the cities, working as waitresses, janitors, street cleaners. They were these, because by then many of the urbanites didn't want those jobs anyway, and they were badly needed in the cities. But that made a big difference in terms of alleviating the so-called poverty in the farm, because these migrants started to save up cash that they could bring home and complement the farm goods that their relatives at home were doing. And to me, I think that was a very important step that made China what it is in terms of urbanization, in terms of making more and more families relatively prosperous, or so-called alleviating the absolute poverty in the countryside. That began because of that in-migration that we detected in the 1980s. So I'm very happy that we did that. I wish we had done that story in a bigger scale as a cover story, perhaps. But at that time, I couldn't convince our editors that it was a big step, a big story. So that's one. I did other stories about farmers' protests in Sichuan, again, protesting over corruption and, poor treatment of farmers and all that. I remember that because I remember when we were doing that story, the local officials didn't want that story out. And so we sneaked in, we started to talk with a group of farmers in a house. And then slowly there were 2 or 3 other people walking in, and they were in fact either police officials or local officials. And we got kind of worried, so we left. And our taxi driver that we hired was so scared because he said those people can be very violent. Another story was about the AIDS epidemic in Henan, in the very poor villages of Henan, where farmers were dying because of the spread of HIV. Why? Because many farmers were selling blood, and to maximize the selling of blood, they would pool blood among them, put them in a big cauldron, and then mix them. There's some chemical thing that happens, and then they inject the blood back onto the donors or the farmers, and it turned out some of them were already infected by HIV, so the epidemic spread among them. Many of them died, parents died. So our story was about the orphans of these farmers who were left behind because of this very harebrained idea. But the thing too is, while we were doing our interviews, the officials, local police and local officials, heard about our presence there. So they were looking for us. And so we played hide and seek with them, and then we scampered away after, of course, with our tapes. And so we were able to do the story for CNN. And what really was a big consolation for me was days later, CNN, our team, were getting letters in other, cities, having watched that piece that we did and offering to give donation to the orphans who were being taken care of by an NGO. And of course, there are many other stories, the landmark events that I have witnessed and covered for Time Magazine and for CNN, the Asian Games in Beijing in 1990, the earthquake in Sichuan, and the 2008 Olympics. I also was fortunate to cover the 1997 handover of Hong Kong. Many of those stories. But to me also what stands out is covering some small stories, light stories, like the opening of the first McDonald's branch in Beijing, and watching Chinese customers lining up to have a taste of this so-called hambaobao, hamburgers. I also watched the concert of Wham, the first Western or foreign pop group to perform in China. I believe it was in 1982. But I remember watching the Chinese audience watching Wham on stage. And the Chinese audience were, emotionless. I think they couldn't figure out what was going on. Obviously, they didn't know the songs. But it was the first time for Chinese audiences to be watching pop music like that. And to me, again, that's one memorable story I did.
I've actually written to the surviving member and asked for an interview about that. I read a story that the audience was shushed by people to sit down and sit and be respectful in a socialist manner?
Sure, I saw that. Some of them were getting excited, they're getting carried away. Of course, there were a small group of foreigners in the audience, and they were the ones who were standing and dancing. They knew the songs, and of course, some Chinese also were getting carried away, and they started to do that. I took pictures of them too, but then there were police and security people who were motioning, telling them shut up, sit down, and it was totally incongruous to what a pop concert would be in other cities.
One of the Good Morning programs in America, I don't know if it was NBC, CBS, or ABC, did a live interview with them the following morning or late at night here. It must have been in Beijing. What was it like to get a live shot out of China in the 1980s?
Well, at that time, I was working for Time magazine, so I didn't have to worry much about photography. But I did know that there were groups of TV crew doing that. I know it was very difficult for them, but they also went to the Great Wall for some photographic sessions there with the Wham singers. But the whole Beijing sports stadium was, not the excited kind of audience that one would expect when you have such a concert. It was quite an experience. But of course, I have to say that was China at that time, when people were still trying to open their minds, open the doors to different cultures. It was very tentative. The people couldn't relate to it, I think, with the exception of a few who probably were already well-traveled or well-read. But otherwise, most of the people there were stunned. They looked stunned and kind of befuddled by what was going on stage.
You just mentioned relate. And that was a question that has been lingering in my head for a while. Namely, you mentioned in a previous talk in Shanghai, China changes when it's good for China.
Correct.
How did people feel in the 1980s and 1990s when foreigners came and there was such a massive wealth gap between foreign experts making huge paychecks, starting businesses, and as you said, many Chinese farmers, Chinese people here still being very poor, suffering? Did people think it was good that foreigners were coming, or what was the mood?
I think it was mixed. I mean, I think many people, of course, had a sense of envy or jealousy that another group is enjoying another kind of life. But at the same time, I would credit the Chinese in that instead of just being envious, they turn it into something positive, which is, if you can have that, we can have that too, if we work hard. And that's what we've been seeing all this time. Instead of going out and demonstrating or burning tires in the streets, most of them decided that I'm gonna work hard, I'm gonna find ways to move on, to move up. And to many of them, the key was education for themselves or for their children. It was very smart because they know that it has worked in the past and it has worked in many other countries, that you cannot just blame others for whatever state you're in. And that, in fact, if you have a chance, you work, you build up on what you have, and and you don't look down on menial jobs, on jobs that earn you only $1 a day or $2 a day. So I think that's a very good work ethic that I admire most among the Chinese, of the Chinese. And I've seen that happen. I've seen, I have a housekeeper from Anhui, famous for poverty and for, providing all the IEs and, laborers, menial laborers in big cities. Over the years, we've had her for over 20 years. Her son, when he was still in high school, would visit her, stayed in our home waiting for her to finish, and he would use our Wi-Fi and get online. Then he got into college, the Aeronautics University. He's doing a PhD now there, and he's helping the family. So that's the kind of success stories, or feel-good stories that we still see happening in many parts of China, and that's why I think many Chinese we see, I could sense that this person is plotting his way onto a better life through hard work, through decent hard work. And again, that's a very admirable work ethic.
There's one moment that I would be remiss, given that you were a journalist for such a long time, if I didn't ask you about. That's that famous date here in the big square, very close to here. Mm-hmm. I'm always very careful about asking people who still live in China, who have a life here, who work here.
Right.
But if you feel comfortable, and if you don't feel comfortable,
sure.
I completely understand.
Mm-hmm.
What's your memory of that day?
Well, that day itself was very emotional, but also very frantic kind of day. I remember my son was running fever. He has the tendency to have seizure. So that day we were forced, my wife and I were forced to take him to a hospital. And I was driving my car. We couldn't get past the barricades along the way to the hospital. So I had to get on the side streets and finally got there, came home. After his treatment, he was in a stable situation. Then you looked out and the streets were changing. The mood out in the streets were changing. So, yeah, I remember that night. It was a very difficult night. But I also remember the first day it all started. That was at night. Also, I got a phone call from a friend who says, "Oh, their students are out demonstrating, marching in the streets." And so I drove over to Peking University where it all started, and hundreds of them were marching towards Tiananmen, and they were doing that to memorialize the former General Secretary Hu Yaobang, who had just died. It was announced he had just died. And so the students wanted to memorialize Hu Yaobang, who they admired as a reform-minded Communist Party leader. So I think for 5 or 6 hours, I followed them, reached Tiananmen close to sunrise. By then, there were only 100 people out in the streets, and then they left a huge banner memorializing Hu, and then we all went back, and I thought that was over, but it wasn't. And then the next subsequent days, more marches were arranged, were organized. For a while, I remember watching a phalanx of PLA soldiers hand arm linked, and they tried to block the students. It was close to Tiananmen already, in front of Zhongnan High. They tried to stop the march. The students just pushed them, and they managed to reach the square. And in a way, that I think was the proverbial coming out of the bottle. It emboldened the students, the youth, but also there was an alignment of stars. The stars aligned during those several weeks. Why? One star was the upcoming visit of Gorbachev. The Chinese leadership had negotiated with the Russian counterparts this landmark visit, state visit of Gorbachev in May, mid-May. So the date was set, and soon enough, over 100 foreign journalists applied to cover the visit. And among them were TV crews with live equipment, cable, to be able to cover.
I think Tom Brokaw was here.
Yeah, and so in early May they started to come, and then the other alignment was the ADB, Asian Development Bank, was going to hold their annual meeting in Beijing, and so I don't know if it's just a coincidence or a smart move. The protesters, the dissident types, organized a hunger strike mid-May, a few days before Gorbachev arrived, and it was a very emotional, dramatic move for them. So they came up with a list of protests, of demands, the students' demands, and so the Chinese have had to cancel the official, welcoming ceremony on the square, because the square was already packed with the hunger strikers. And soon enough, more and more groups, more and more agencies, more and more ministries, people started to offer sympathy. And they even started to bring food and water. And meantime, all that was being watched overseas in the living room of people, because they were able to report them live overseas. And of course, that led to a snowballing of the protests. By the end of May, early June, I thought it was over. In fact, many of the student leaders had declared victory and had called on their followers to go back to the campuses. But then another wave of student protesters would arrive from other provinces, and then the four intellectuals declared sympathy, and they joined the hunger strike. So it went up again, until finally, June 3rd, the PLA troops forced their way into the square and surrounded the square, and that was it. It ended tragically.
Were you there?
I was not on the square itself when that happened. I was closer to the other parts, because there were three of us working for time, and we had divided the time frame and the places where we would be to cover it. I was supposed to start my shift past midnight, but of course I was already out before that, because there are many things going on.
I think it was the Time photographer who took the famous photo, right?
Yes, on the bridge, very close here. That was probably one of the first casualties. And I saw that happening. The truck was being chased by an APC, and then it fell over, or it turned, and then it crushed one of the protesters. And that was on the cover of Time. Now, Time magazine had already planned a cover. That was a Sunday, right? Our cover story was going to be different. It was not about Tiananmen at all, because we had thought it was over. But so when it happened, we were given a few hours to report, and we changed the cover for that week. So they held the press and changed the cover. They gave us a few hours. So by the next day, we were still typing away our last reports.
That was a very heavy topic, so I want to ask you something light after that. Do you eat spicy food now?
I do now. I love spicy food now. Not when I was on the farm in 1971, 72. No, that was a big adjustment for me. Filipinos, except a few regions in the Philippines, which are famous for some spicy food. Filipinos typically do not like to eat spicy food. We tend to like more of the kind of like with Fujian or Shanghai type of food, Cantonese type. So when I was in Hunan on the farm, our designated cook could only put together as spicy dishes, and so that was quite a challenge to avoid eating spicy food. I mean, even the omelets that he cooked had spices on top of it. So that was good. But then a few years later, I started to get a liking for Hunanese and Sichuanese food, and now, I look for it. I hanker for it.
Have you ever asked yourself who you would be if you had never gone on that trip?
I guess I had thought of that. I don't know. I could have been a professional journalist in the Philippines, or a professional revolutionary underground, probably jailed, or I could have been a boring advertising executive back home. No regrets. I think I prefer what I am now.
And instead you became the sitting ambassador. How did that happen?
Oh, it's part of the cycle of my life. Just going with the flow. I never really imagined myself to be an ambassador here, just as I never imagined myself to be a foreign correspondent in China. But because of my experience as a student, later as a foreign correspondent, China watcher, fluent in Chinese, many friends in China, I think because of that, I was offered this job. I didn't go through any job interviews. I was just told, are you able and willing? And I said I'd think about it. I thought about it. I consulted my wife, and we thought, we remembered somebody saying, you guys complain about the Philippines and what's wrong with the Philippines, but when you are given the opportunity to serve, you don't serve. And we thought that that person had a point, and that this was a chance for me to serve the public, serve the government. I'd never worked for the government ever. So this is the first time I have the chance, the privilege to do something for my country. And I'm very proud to have taken this job, and I intend to do my best live up to expectations.
I ask you that because diplomacy has also changed your life. Through the efforts of diplomats, you got back your passport.
Correct. Yes. And in a way, I'm probably just paying back. When I couldn't go home for 12 years, and then finally I had a chance through a friend, diplomat here, introduced me to the ambassador at that time, a retired general who was very close to the president. And so he invited me to visit the embassy right here. And at that time, he was a very, very professional gentleman. And but he also loved playing badminton. In fact, right here, they converted part of this into a kind of badminton hall. So I played badminton with him. Badminton diplomacy worked for me because soon after, when the ambassador was asked what he thought about my application for a new passport, he told the palace, the government officer back in Manila that, yeah, he's a good boy. We should give him one. And so I really am very grateful for the kindness that have been shown to me all these years.
I want to be respectful of your time, but one question that I am sure you have heard a million times, and other journalists also from BBC or New York Times have heard is, oh, you guys are all spies. Mm-hmm. Which usually comes out when there's a story that somebody doesn't like.
Right.
What's your reply to people like that?
Well, of course, spies wouldn't be spies if they're doing things so openly, and I think in the end, the best argument to that is your actual work, your record, what you do day to day, and they can see that. And there's a difference between reporting for the public through the media and reporting to whatever government agencies that spies work for. But it's true. It's very easy to make that conclusion or allegation, and there's no other effective reply to that, but to simply say my work speaks for itself.
I completely believe that. Final question is, do you still think there is value for young Chinese people, but also for young foreigners to go to each other's countries?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a big advocate of people-to-people exchanges, of educational exchanges, to learn from each other, because I've seen what happens if a country, a society, close off from the rest of the world. You see what happened in China in the 60s and 70s, when you have people growing up without knowing other cultures, different cultures, without knowing how diverse our world is. So I believe that through education, through language learning, through just sports and cultural exchanges, that's the best cure for narrow-mindedness, for whatever we are afraid of in terms of people being, politically correct or woke. And narrow-mindedness is, I think, the very dangerous for any society. So the best cure to that is openness, more engagement, free flow of information. And I hope all countries will do that. I hope China will do that. And I hope many countries will continue to engage China instead of isolating China. And I hope China will continue to open up its doors instead of closing up as they've done before, because we know the result when a country, a society close off, no winners, all losers.